In case you don't know, I've been here at the Douglas for 20 some odd years, close to 27 years. I started in the cognitive behavior therapy service. We dealt with a lot of anxiety disorders, depression and so on. And then I became chief of psychology for a number of years and recently left that position to deal with public education because this is what I enjoy. I enjoy being able to teach without having to deal with evaluations and grades and anything else. You can evaluate me if you want. It doesn't really matter, but I don't have to evaluate you. Just pay attention, learn what you can, and ask whatever questions you want. And the goal is to have as stimulating an exchange as possible by the end of the night. And of course, I always learn just as much when I teach from the people I speak to as they might from me. So, with that in mind, we're going to talk about post-traumatic stress. I've talked about other lighter topics in the past. Today, unfortunately, we're going to talk about something serious, but I think the message is one of hope, and I think that's the key. Post-traumatic stress disorder, can I go back there? Essentially, it refers to being able to face what you went through, face the same place, and so on. So I'm going to start by asking you two questions. Number one, what kind of world do you live in? Do you live in a world that is safe or a world that is generally dangerous? Now, depending on how you answer that question, this might anticipate the second question. Do you live in a black and white world? Because the fact is, if you can say yes or no, it's a safe world, then chances are you live in a very black and white world. And if you say, well, it's kind of safe, it's a little safe, it's relatively safe or relatively dangerous, then you live in a gray world. These are two important questions that apply to post-traumatic stress. We'll come back to them later, but I want to start with that. So today, we're going to start by talking about anxiety, since PTSD is an anxiety disorder. And I don't want to belabor the anxiety discussion. I've presented anxiety before. If you want to see one of our earlier videos on our website, you're welcome to do so. But I will do a brief overview of anxiety and why we have it. And once we understand anxiety, we can understand post-traumatic stress a little better. So when is anxiety itself a problem and when is it a good thing? What is a normal response to trauma? What happens when we face trauma? What is a kind of response that we can go through? And then how does that distinguish itself from PTSD? What is the difference between trauma and PTSD? That's the main question I'm going to try and answer tonight. Finally, I will speak a little bit about treating PTSD, and of course we'll have time during the question period as well. So let's start with this. Why do we have anxiety? It's an instinct. It's an alarm that the body feels whenever we are confronted with a danger. Of course, we grew up, we evolved in nature, and in nature we have predators and tigers and lions and bears and so on. So we need to have anxiety. It's a protective instinct. It is essentially an emotion, and all emotions are calls to action. It's an alarm that rings in the presence of danger. And when it does, when we feel it, the way it protects us is it makes us do something. It makes us respond by either running away or attacking, defending ourselves in some way, or we will avoid it if we can, or we'll control it in some way. Now, usually we talk about this as the fight or flight response. So if there's a tiger coming at you, you're going to run. It's the first thing you're going to do. If, on the other hand, you're trapped, you're going to do your best to take a rock or a branch and try to attack it and kill it if you can. That's the fight or flight response. All animals have it. But human beings can also think. We also anticipate. If we think there are tigers in this forest, we're going to avoid going there. Or if we think about things that can happen in the future, we then want to make sure that we can control our environment so it doesn't happen. So control becomes something that we do in order to avoid something dangerous. So anxiety makes us respond to it. That's how it protects us. So, very simple. In any presence of any danger, the alarm rings. We feel anxiety, and of course we respond. We do this running away, we avoid, we control, we do what we have to do. The interesting thing about anxiety is that if it's an imagined danger or an exaggerated danger, the body responds the same way. It doesn't distinguish between a tiger and an elevator if you're scared of an elevator. And the interesting thing is that if you're scared of an elevator, in that particular case, it's perhaps an imagined danger. You're not going to die and suffocate in an elevator. On the other hand, there could be real things, such as a traffic accident. If you're in a traffic accident, you can't say it's just imagined. It can happen, but at the same time, if you're so scared that it's happening all the time, or you think it's going to happen anytime, any place, then it's exaggerated. So when you respond to those things, the interesting thing that happens is that you confirm your beliefs. If you run away, if you take the stairs because you're scared of an elevator, what's going to happen is you're going to feel so much better. You're going to feel relieved, and you thank God I wasn't there at the elevator. It kind of confirms to your body that the elevator was something to avoid, that it was something dangerous. So what it does is it feeds this belief that it's dangerous. It just feeds the imagination. So the more we avoid, the more we develop anxiety. And the interesting thing there is that if you're avoiding something like a tiger, it's good to be more sensitized. It's good to avoid and to learn that thing. Except if you're applying it to things that aren't dangerous, like elevators, then all you're doing is you're limiting yourself and living in a smaller and smaller prison over time. Now we'll talk about the response later on, but that's a key factor. Okay, we'll come back to this slide in a little bit. So, how much anxiety should we feel? If you drive like crazy, and when it's raining you don't slow down, or when it's snowing you don't slow down, or you never exercise, you eat junk food all day long, you never see a doctor because you don't really like doctors, and so on and so forth, and it's a hassle. Well, perhaps in a case like that you don't have enough anxiety, because anxiety is needed. You need anxiety, and that's what keeps us driving more slowly. If you have too much anxiety, what do? We stay home, we don't drive. We'll eat nothing but squash. I don't want a heart attack, so I'm going to eat squash all day long. It's got no fat. Well, okay, enjoy it. But, or you spend all day on the internet checking your symptoms and so on and so forth. And you know these people, there are probably a few of them in this room. So the fact is that in a case like that, perhaps you have a tad too much anxiety. The point of this slide is simple. The point of this slide is that you need anxiety in balance. Not enough anxiety, you're not protected. Too much anxiety, you're restricted. So if we go back to the driving example, obviously if a person doesn't have enough fear, they don't respect the rules of the road, they drive fast, they don't slow down, they don't worry about their tire pressure, whether they have bald tires, those kinds of things. They don't worry about their brakes. So they actually put themselves and everyone else in danger because they don't have enough anxiety. But at the other end of the spectrum, if you have too much, then you just don't drive, you don't function. So you need some anxiety to be protected, but it has to be in balance, otherwise your functioning is affected. Okay? So, where does it come from? Once again, I don't want to get into too much detail here, but I'll just briefly review part of an earlier talk. I'll give you a choice here. Let's start with, there's three things really that contribute to anxiety, where it comes from. First of all, there's an instinct. Let me give you a choice. I'm going to give you a choice of A, I'll put a snake underneath your chair. It'll slither around between your legs. That's choice number one. Choice number two, I'll put a tarantula on your shoulder. Okay? You guys ready for that one? Choice number three, I'll ask you, with oven mitts on, to remove a cake from the oven. Which would you rather choose? What would you rather do? You guys will take the cake out of the oven. Interesting. Nobody wants a spider? Now, if you think about this, how many of you have been bit by a snake? How many of you have been bit by a poisonous spider? How many of you have been burnt on your stove or in your oven? So So why is it that you're not comfortable with spiders and snakes despite the fact that you've had no bad experiences with them, and you're not scared of taking a cake out of the oven even though you've been burnt many times? Because instinctively, we're not prepared to learn things that in nature don't exist. We evolved in a world without ovens. And as a result, we learned the things that we needed to learn. So some of anxiety is instinct. That's all there is to it. Don't try and figure out what happened and why and all this other stuff. It's just there. It's part of everyone. Okay? Another part of it is what is our own makeup. If you have more than one child, who has more than one child here? Are they exactly the same? They're very different. If you have brothers or sisters, same thing. Aunts and uncles. We're very different. You'll see it very early on in development. You'll see it in the womb sometimes. You'll feel it in the womb. Fact is that some people are very easygoing. Nothing seems to bother them. Other kids are always hard-headed. Some are like this. They won't give up anything. And some are always smiling. Some always seem like life is so hard, and so on. So the fact is that we all have more or less of the instinct of fear. Okay? So, some of it is part of human nature, period. Some of it is part of our own individual makeup. And then, of course, there's experiences. There's the events that happen around us. There's attitudes. There's what we learn is dangerous or not dangerous in our society. If we are overprotected, we'll be a little more scared of things. If we're not, you grow up in the wild, you're going to be encouraged to climb trees. You grow up in the city, you're going to be told, be careful, trees are dangerous, and so on. So there's learning. There's attitude, and of course you have experiences, and when something bad happens, it's going to affect your perception of what's dangerous and what you should be scared of. So just to summarize, essentially, anxiety comes from these three different sources. Part of it is human nature. Part of it is your own individual nature, and then the rest of it comes from the environment. So you're born with a certain amount of anxiety, and you also learn a certain amount of anxiety. So how can it manifest itself? You know, we talk about phobias and we talk about obsessions and so on. Essentially, what happens when you're scared of something, you try to avoid it. So you'll avoid dangerous places. You'll avoid shopping centers if that's where you get panic attacks. You'll avoid metros. You'll avoid heights and so on. Parking lots or busy intersections if you've been assaulted. You'll avoid dangerous situations. Oh, this is, there's too many people here. I might sweat, I might shake in front of people, so I don't want to be around them. Or it's too hot, or here's a class where I may have to give a talk, so forget about that class, and so on. Essentially, what happens when you're scared, you try to control everything. You'll control your environment, you'll control the people around you. You make sure you stay with me when I take the metro or when I go shopping, and so on and so forth. I'm going to go in the changing room, you stay right here and don't leave here, okay? You make sure you stay here, this kind of stuff. So we tend to make sure that we have everything we need so that the bad stuff won't happen. You know, I'll have my little bottle of whiskey in my purse just in case I have a panic attack or those kind of things, okay? So, when does a normal fear become a disorder? What is the difference between just regular anxiety or fear or a phobia? There are two things. In psychiatry, a lot of our diagnoses are not really something you can measure. It's not a blood test that will show the presence or absence of a certain type of cell. It is a judgment call. And we look at two main things. How does it affect your life, essentially, in two different ways? One is, does it make you suffer? So if you're taking a class, let's say, and in your class you have to give a talk. That's part of your class. And the talk is on Wednesday. And for a week, you're freaked out. All semester, you're freaked out. You're nervous, you're scared, you're obsessing over this talk, and then Sunday night comes, you don't sleep, Monday you don't sleep, Tuesday you don't sleep, you're freaking out, and you get to the talk and you do your talk, and you get through it and you suffer, but you get through it. Well, you got through it, but you paid a heavy price. And so when something causes that exaggerated amount of suffering, certainly that's one criteria. So do we suffer greatly? Are we constantly preoccupied by something? And that is at a different level than someone who just isn't comfortable giving a talk. If, on the other hand, you don't have any problem whatsoever and you sleep like a baby Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday because you dropped the class, then, yeah, okay, you didn't suffer, you're not suffering, but you're not functioning very well. Someone who drops out of school because they're afraid of giving talks, then the anxiety is controlling their lives. If someone refuses a promotion because it involves travel, then again, it is the anxiety that is telling them what job to take or what job not to take. So when your function is affected, either social or occupational, you don't see friends because it involves travel off island, let's say, and you're scared of crossing a bridge. Well, the fact is that when we look at psychiatric problems, if the problem takes a lot of space in their heads, if they're constantly thinking about it more than another person, or if they can't do what they would normally do, then we say this is an anxiety disorder or depression or something of that nature. Okay? All right, so enough about anxiety. Now let's talk about a more serious topic. We're going to talk about trauma. But I want to start with this little diagram here, because I said to you earlier that essentially the response is important. If you had someone that you knew who was afraid of an elevator, what would you tell them to do? Well, they're going to take the stairs. They're going to take the stairs all the time. What would you tell them instead? Come with you. Come with me, I'll show you. Okay? You think about that. Now, normally, their anxiety is saying, take the stairs. They're responding to anxiety. You're saying, no, don't take the stairs. Don't listen to your anxiety, listen to me. Okay? And if the treatment of an elevator phobia is taking an elevator, then why does anyone have that fear? Everyone with an elevator phobia has taken the elevator thousands of times and they freak out. Oh, you have to take the metro if you're afraid of the metro. But I've already taken the metro. That's why I'm scared. Okay? So you think about it. If someone gets on the elevator, they feel uncomfortable. There's too many people, I'll take the stairs. I feel better. And then, the next time they get on an elevator, they see people coming down the hallway. Looks like there's going to be too many people. I'll take the stairs. I feel better. And you do that slowly but surely. You just, it's only 2 floors, I'll take the stairs again. And every time you listen to your anxiety, it gets worse and worse and worse. So the fact is that just getting on an elevator or trying to get on an elevator doesn't necessarily make you better. It depends on the experience you have when you go through it. If you face it in a way that you learn there was nothing to be scared of, over time fears go down. If you run away every time, or you leave a situation when anxiety is peaking, and you feel bad, okay, I'll get in the elevator, okay, 2 floors, 10 seconds, 5 seconds, 3, 2, 1, open, you get out. Thank God. I did my homework, my psychologist told me to take the elevator. Well, you ain't going to get better if you do that, because you're going to have this horrible memory that it was terrible to do. So that's how fears get sensitized. It is how you respond to them that matters. This is an important diagram, because fears can either get better over time or they can get worse over time. And this applies to trauma. So, let's talk about trauma. As I said, a serious topic. There's all kinds of things. Some of you may have experienced something not very pleasant or horrific in the past. Trauma can be something that you've experienced directly. The common ones, car accidents, rape. People who are in wars often develop PTSD because they are exposed to many things. Their best friend blown up next to them, or rockets coming in and hitting the people, or hitting the spot where they just were, those kinds of things. Any other kind of physical assault. So it could be direct assault on you, or you could witness something. So a trauma doesn't have to be direct. You could be in a movie theater when there's a shooting, or you could have been at Dawson when there was a shooting. and maybe you were just in the hallway and you stopped at a Coke machine and someone passed you, and then that person got shot. And you said, had I not stopped, that would have been me. Or you could be at the bus stop and you see a car accident, those kinds of things. So trauma is, there could be 20 people at that intersection and one person is traumatized by it. So it depends really on how you see yourself and the details of what you were involved in and so on. So trauma could be direct or indirect. So, how do we deal with trauma? What is a quote-unquote normal response to trauma? I was interviewed following the Virginia Tech shooting. And I said to the interviewer, I said, every response is normal. And I'm not sure researchers would agree with me, but I couldn't think of a better thing to say. Because to me, there are so many different responses to trauma that no one should tell you what's normal and what isn't. It's nightmarish, it's intense, that's what trauma is. There is no way around it, it's a nightmare. And it produces a storm of emotions, a roller coaster of emotions. And that means that you may, at some point, say, yeah, I'm okay, things are okay. And you might feel that. And then an hour later, you're falling apart, and so on. And it's going to happen like that for quite a while. So this roller coaster, you're going to be swept along. It's going to be like a storm and going in different directions. And people who fight those emotions really question themselves. A real key, to me anyway, is that trauma never goes away. It doesn't have to. You'd like it to, but it's not going to go away. If you've lost someone in the past, someone that you loved, you may not think about the person all the time, especially if it's been many years. But when you think about them, you still feel pain. You still feel the loss. So it's a memory that's going to stay with you all your lives. And you know what? We have good memories, we have bad memories. We don't have to go in there and erase them. The reality of it is they're going to be part of us, and the challenge is to learn to cope with what our lives are and put trauma in its place, which is a place where you feel pain but doesn't have to control you anymore. Okay? When I say no such thing as normal, other than all reactions are normal, over time, in most cases, over time, it takes less and less of our thoughts. This could take some days, it could take weeks, it could take years. The fact is that, if two people go through the same thing, just take a more common example. Take an example of losing a parent or losing a loved one. If two people lose their fathers in the same week, who's going to get over it faster? One person might be able to function pretty well, and another one might not be able to function for a long, long time. Does that make one person weaker or whatever? It just means they're different. Death represents different things to them and so on. So we can't expect to be the same, and same with trauma. Trauma is just going to affect everyone differently. It's not something you get over, it's something that takes a long time, but the goal is, over time, to be able to function relatively normally. And I'll show you a couple of graphs in a few minutes about those kinds of responses. But first, I want to take a personal note here. Especially when I was chief of psychology and now that I'm involved in public education, whenever there is an event, there is a death, there is a shooting, a death in a sporting event, they call the psychologists. After Dawson, they had tables of psychologists and they had students line up and speak to them. That's what we all do. Recently there was shooting you might have heard about recently, and of course the question is always, okay, let's make sure that we have services available. And after Haiti, I had a list of professionals who were interested in helping. And the fact is that that's not really what people need at that time. You know, they're in distress, they suffer. Because they suffer, we want to help. We want to call in the specialists. But what do they really need? Well, they need a lot of things. I'm not sure speaking to a stranger, no matter how nice and charming that psychologist could be. Fact is that I'm really just a stranger. And they need, above all, space, and it could be physical space, it could be emotional space. People needed time to deal with it. They want to be surrounded by loved ones. At Dawson, they want to be with other students. They want to hug each other. They want to go to their families and be with people they knew, people they were comfortable with. They wanted to sometimes just be alone. And that's the reality of it. That's what they need. And it's great to have help available. But just because they're suffering and we say, well, here are people who are supposed to help you, therefore this is important. Well, unfortunately, that's not really what they need at that time. We need to make help available to them, that's for sure, but we can't force it on them. Interesting thing is that they often need help, but not right away. And I counseled a young woman who was at Dawson when it happened. And I saw her a couple of sessions and we spoke. And then after that, I said, well, you know, give me a buzz at some point and we'll see how things are going. But because she worked not far away, I was able to drop by one day and saw she was. And that's important. To me, a couple of months later is really when you get a sense of how they're functioning. So give them the space, make help available, but really they need to be with friends and loved ones and so on. Of course they need time, and there's no help in the world that's going to accelerate the clock. So we need to give them the time that it takes to overcome it, or to start overcoming it, more accurately. We do, however, need to follow up. Occasionally, a person says, just give me space, and we give them space. And then after, we go about our business, and a week or two, a month has passed, 2 months have passed, and we stop talking about it. But then sometimes we notice that the person isn't really doing how they normally would do. They're not functioning very well. They're withdrawing, they're maybe irritable, they seem lost, and so on. And I would respect them and give them the time it takes, but if you see that they're really having a hard time, maybe you should encourage them, listen, you know, maybe it's time you spoke to someone. The problem with that is that if they hear that from 10 people in a day or 10 people in a week, they're going to feel almost assaulted by it. So be careful not to overdo it. That's really important. Just be there, make the message gentle, but give them the space and just make it available whenever they would need it. Essentially, just because you want to, you can't erase trauma. You can't go into their brains and erase the pain. I wish we could, but we can't. All right. Let me talk about this. We know about Pavlov's dog. Interesting thing about Pavlov's dog. Pavlov's a physiologist, for those of you who don't know. If you ring a bell, or if I do this, and I have a dog next to me, the dog is not going to respond, other than maybe look at the noise. But if I do this and give the dog a treat, give it a treat, won't take long before the dog starts salivating. My dog, when I would strip open the little piece of, what was it, the cheese strings, little zip, he'd be right there. Or if I was eating my apple, he knew he would get the apple core. He'd be right there just drooling, because that's what dogs do, right? But the first time we hear a noise, it doesn't matter. It doesn't do anything. But when you start associating things, when you start associating a noise with something good, then the dog feels hunger and starts responding to it. Well, the same thing. If I, give you a whiff of perfume and throw $20 at you, the same whiff of perfume, throw $20 at you, at some point the perfume is going to make you go, ooh, I can't wait. So we all develop these kind of memories. When something happens, whether it's pleasant or negative, it gets associated with sights, sounds, and smells, and all the things around us, all the reminders of it. When 9/11 happened, we know where we were, because something really powerfully emotional will burn itself to all of the associated stimuli around you. This is important because if you're in a car accident in November and it's raining and there's wet leaves on the ground, the presence of wet leaves is going to give you a feeling. I spoke to a person who survived the earthquake in Haiti. And I said, you know, I bet you at some point, maybe down the road, you're going to be walking by a construction site. And you're going to smell cement. And that smell of cement is going to remind you of what happened. And you're going to have these things hit you from time to time. Just recognize them for what they are. It's like the bell that makes the dog salivate. It's like the perfume that reminds you of your first date. It's like the tortilla that reminds you of grandma's house. Those are things that are going to happen. And when you experience a trauma, unfortunately what happens is it also becomes associated with all the sights and sounds and smells of that trauma. If there's music playing, that music will bring you back in time. And the reason I bring up Pavlov's dog is because the salivation is a physiological process. We feel physically something in the presence of a noise or a smell or a sound. So if you've been in a trauma, if you've been in a car accident or some other event happened to you, reminders of it are going to trigger the same emotional reactions inside your body. And that takes a while to go away. So intense events burn into our memories and become paired with those associated stimuli. They are unpleasant, and because they're unpleasant, we tend to avoid them. That's another important fact. We avoid unpleasant reminders. And so if we're thinking about this car accident that happened at that intersection, and there, let's say, are a lot of cars, and it's a busy intersection. Whenever you're around a busy intersection, you might also feel the same memories. So then you're going to start avoiding the busy intersection, and another busy intersection, and another busy intersection, until eventually you close off your world. So these are unpleasant reminders, and as a result, they can trigger further avoidance, and the more you avoid, the worse it gets. And so because things like sights and smells and sounds, you know, you're trying to avoid the news because you don't want to hear about another car accident or another rape victim or another shooting. And yet you're watching TV and you hear about it. You decide you're not going to watch TV. You're at work and someone's at the water cooler talking about it. These are going to constantly remind you. And when you try and get away from them, they end up happening everywhere because they're greater and greater reminders. And so you live in a world that becomes more and more menacing in the case of PTSD, and we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that there are a roller coaster of emotions that happen following a trauma. And I said also that trauma obviously isn't going to just go away. And here's kind of my own version, my own rendition of what I think is a relatively normal response to trauma. Over time, and this time could be anything. This time could be days, it could be months, it could be in some cases years. And intensity could vary from person to person. But in general, over time, you're going to start seeing a lessening of intensity. Maybe it goes up for a little bit, it goes down, maybe it goes up again, goes down. So it's not going to be a smooth line. You're going to have some days, some months that are harder than others based on reminders, based on circumstances, and so on. But in general, over time, it's going to be a little less overwhelming. That is a relatively normal response. It's not fun, as you can see. It could be intense, very unpleasant, but over time, it will it will start to dissipate. Having said that, I want to distinguish between trauma and PTSD. PTSD is a specific condition that happens in a small percentage of cases. Not everyone with trauma is going to develop PTSD. This is PTSD. In the case of PTSD, instead of getting better, there's two kinds of cases you often see. In the case of the blue one here, the trauma happens, and then, so this could be quite intense. I just put it down there to show you, but the fact is it could be quite an intense emotional response. But rather than getting better, it slowly gets worse over time. In some cases, a person will actually start getting better, and then the curve starts to go up again. And slowly but surely they start developing more and more problems. So the difference between trauma and PTSD is that trauma tends to, over time, dissipate. There's a small percentage of people where time doesn't help. It just gets worse and worse and worse, and they develop more and more nightmares and flashbacks, and it takes more space in their lives. So we're going to talk about why that happens. Okay? But first, I am going to present my only clinical slide of the day. I don't like to use a lot of technical terms, and I don't think it's all that helpful in any case. Most diagnoses are there for research purposes and so on, and they help us decide what we're talking about so everyone knows, everyone is describing the same thing. But in reality, I prefer to talk about what we go through and how we perceive things and so on. Having said that, there are three main factors that give rise to a diagnosis, an official diagnosis of PTSD. And of course, it has to be intense enough that it causes suffering or it affects our functioning. So that's the measuring stick. But there are three things. First of all, the obvious one, they have to have had experienced the trauma or witnessed one. Okay? Now, that's obvious because, of course, it's post-trauma, so it starts with a trauma. But the person also relives the event. They relive it through flashbacks and nightmares and those kinds of things. First gentleman I saw when I was a student had survived a plane crash. Something like 80 people died and 60 survived, or vice versa. I don't remember the details of it. Here was a person 20 years later, in the middle of the night, would wake up screaming several times a night. That his wife, they lived in a duplex. They decided to kick out the tenants so he can have a place upstairs to sleep, so he wouldn't wake up everyone. And he wasn't able to keep a job. Whenever he would, like if he was waiting tables, if someone broke a glass, he would throw everything in the air and he'd clutch at his heart for 10 minutes. This person was completely destroyed by this event. And this was 20 years later. And he just wasn't able to function, and he kept reliving it. Every noise brought him back to the event. Every night was a nightmare, over and over again. So we somehow will re-experience things. That's another important criteria. And the third thing is, this is a key here, there's a persistent avoidance of reminders. An avoidance, again, you avoid an intersection, you'll avoid music, you'll avoid a person in a leather jacket if you were assaulted, those kinds of things. Imagine you're assaulted by someone in a leather jacket and then walk down the city street. How's that going to be if you try to avoid them? Every person who's out there, you're going to cross the street, cross back, close your car windows, lock your doors, and so on and so forth, until finally you just stay home because you're terrified. It becomes more and more overwhelming when you start avoiding. So there's an avoidance, or a psychological avoidance, if you will, sort of a numbness of response to them. So those are the criteria in the DSM, which is a diagnostic manual in psychiatry. So I have a way of seeing the difference between trauma and PTSD. Is my own, I guess my own gross oversimplification of it, and it is an oversimplification. But to me, trauma is primarily, the challenge of trauma is primarily about overcoming the past. You had an event, you have to deal with it, and it's difficult. It could take you a long time, it could be a struggle. But having said that, the challenge is to be able to try to return to a normal level of functioning. Okay, so It's over, and now I got to somehow accept it and deal with it. In the case of PTSD, I think the problem that happens in PTSD is not only do you have to deal with the past, but you also have to deal with the future. Because a person with PTSD doesn't just relive the past, they're also terrified of it happening again. And so now their life becomes menacing. It's not so much, well, it's the same trauma that anyone else goes through. They have to deal with that. But they've lost their sense of safety. And not only did they have a horrible car accident, but they can have another one tomorrow. And to them, it's very likely. To you, having a car accident is possible, but not highly likely. To them, it feels real. And as a result, they have to face a world that is now dangerous to them. And when the world is dangerous, we avoid, and we stay away, and we become hypervigilant, and so on and so forth. And that's the problem with PTSD. That's why it gets worse, because when you try to convince yourself that nothing is going to happen, nothing bad is going to happen, you're never going to succeed. So again, an oversimplification, obviously, but generally the difference is that the person with PTSD has a tendency to worry about it happening again, much more so than someone who has lived the trauma and gone through it. Oversimplification, of course, you're always, when something happens, if you've been burnt, you're going to worry about being burnt again. It's just that worry doesn't control your life so much. In the case of PTSD, those things control you. If we recall the slide on the difference between normal anxiety and an anxiety disorder is how much it controls your life. Okay? So let me talk a couple of stories about sensitization, because once you go through something, it affects how you see dangers. Let's suppose that you're in a car accident. You're in a serious car accident, and you barely survive. It takes you 6 months to recover. You're in hospital, someone may have died, and so on, and somehow you make it out. And we're leaving this lecture tonight, and we discover you and I are going to the same place. Do you want to share a ride? So we decide to share a ride in the back of a taxi. So now we're riding in the back of the same taxi at the same time. Who is more likely to die in a car accident? Someone said the driver. You're probably right. Of the two of us, who's more likely to die? And if you think about it, of course, the obvious answer is, well, we're in the back seat of the same car at the same time. Chances are equal. We both have a chance of dying that's about the same. However, who's going to feel the risk more? The person who experienced it is going to be aware that they may die, much more so than the person who hasn't experienced it. And that's important because the risk hasn't changed. The risk is the same for both of us. When we drive home tonight, we all are facing the possibility of a car accident. Yet it is a minuscule possibility, but it is real. Whereas a person who's lived it, it feels huge. A person who just drives everywhere and doesn't act on it, just keeps driving and doesn't think over time, doesn't even feel this. They feel zero. So our experiences will affect how we are sensitized to fears. It doesn't change the reality. It just changes our sensitization to them. And that's important. So once a person has been through a trauma, they are more sensitive to the risks than another person. Okay? So previous experiences will influence how we perceive the risks today, even when they remain unchanged. And of course, as we said, the more you avoid something, the more you reinforce the idea that it was dangerous, and therefore was to be avoided. So avoidance reinforces the beliefs, and as a result, makes the fear get bigger and bigger. So that's how you sensitize fear. And a person with PTSD, sees the fear bigger, and then they start avoiding, and as a result, the avoidance makes the fear bigger and bigger over time, and that's why they have that upward slope. Here's another thing. They also become hypervigilant. They become super aware. I'll give you this example. We have received reliable reports of a possible terrorist attack sometime tomorrow in Montreal. Okay? Let's suppose you hear that on the news tonight. And so tomorrow, how are you going to be? They're going to say, by the way, you should go live your lives as normal. We're not going to be affected by terrorism and threats and so on. So they want you all to go to school and go to work and so on. Well, how are you going to pass your day? Oh, there's a truck parked in front of a building that seems to be an old truck that's abandoned. Or the windows are smoked out. Or there's a guy who's wearing a jacket that's kind of a puffy jacket and he looks nervous. There's the guy with a beard. There's the guy with a mustache over there. You are going to see threats everywhere, right? We would all do that. Everyone with a parka is going to be a potential terrorist. Everyone with a facial hair or a hood or anything of that nature. Any car that's parked in an unusual place. Any crowd. So when we think about potential danger, we will see it everywhere. If a person was attacked or if a person experienced a trauma, they become hypervigilant, hyper aware of every potential threat that's coming around the corner. And that's important because the more you become aware of those things, the more the tendency is to avoid them. And again, the more you avoid them, the stronger the fear gets because you tend to live in a prison that's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So, let's go back to our two questions. Do you live in a safe world? And do you live in a black and white world? Why are these questions important? Well, because I think there are two types of personalities that are more vulnerable to develop PTSD. Of course, we're all equally vulnerable to trauma. I showed this slide to a colleague and she says, but aren't we all just as vulnerable? I said, yeah, of course, we're all just as vulnerable to trauma. Okay, it could happen to anyone, unfortunately. It's not as if some people are more prone to have it. But once it happens, a certain number of people are more prone to develop PTSD as it distinguishes itself from regular trauma. One is the person who lives in a scary world. The person, for example, who was in the plane crash, it was a horrific event, as you can imagine. But it took that one event, obviously. People who tend to be a little bit shy and scared and nervous, you know, the types that feel as if the world is kind of a menacing place. And there are a lot of us like that. A lot of people, don't feel completely safe anywhere. Bad things can happen. And if you're the kind of person who thinks bad things can happen, when something like that happens, it just reinforces that belief. And see, then you can't function anymore. The world goes from already scary to a horrible place that you can't function in. So that kind of personality has a tendency to develop PTSD more so than others. Okay? Those are the people who don't feel as if the world is safe to begin with. Then there's other people. The people that tend to develop anxiety problems, especially in case of PTSD, are those who think more in absolute black and white kind of terms. And that's because to them the world is either safe or it's not safe. There's no such thing as it's pretty safe or it's kind of safe. To them it's either good or it's bad. And so occasionally for them they experience a trauma. And it's horrible and it takes a while to overcome it. But at some point they can say to themselves, okay, it happened, it's a once-in-a-lifetime thing, it's over, it's behind me. They experience sometimes a second event. The second event could be quite minor and totally messes them up. Give me an example of a woman. She was assaulted physically. It was a case of mistaken identity, but someone thought she was a girlfriend of someone who owed money. Anyway, started beating her up pretty bad, and she defended herself. At one point, the assailant put his arm around her, and she bit his forearm real deep, stunk her teeth into his arm. He ripped his arm out, pulled all her teeth with it. Okay. It was a horrible, horrible assault. Took her a long time to overcome it and had surgery and all this other stuff. But she got back to work and actually did pretty well. Then she's working in a bank and she's sitting off to the side at the desk, and some guy comes in, puts a gun out, hands it back to the teller, teller takes it back, puts money in, gives it back, the guy takes off. That's it. It wasn't her. She was sitting over on the side, but she just saw the gun, and from that moment on, she wasn't able to work. She wasn't able to have a shower. She would hear a noise, she'd turn off the shower, go check. At night, if she'd hear a noise, she'd get up, she'd go check downstairs, make the windows were closed, go back to bed, hear another noise, go back down, check the windows. Driving in her car, if there's someone with a leather jacket, she'd close the windows, she'd cross the street, this kind of stuff. Totally non-functional because of the second event. And many times that happens. In a lot of cases of PTSD, they have, let's say, a horrible car crash, and then they have just a minor fender bender. And somehow the fender bender is the one that really puts them over the edge. And I think the reason for that is because to them, they live in a world that is straightforward, black and white. They have an event, they somehow are able to convince themselves it was exceptional. Okay, once in a lifetime, they're back in their safe world. Then all of a sudden they say, no. It can happen anywhere, anytime. And then they live in a dangerous world. And that's when they start obsessing and controlling and avoiding. A soldier who, sees his best friend blow up next to him may not necessarily develop PTSD. But then, a week later, if there's a bomb that goes off in a bed that he just got out of, that could be the event. I mean, obviously it takes both of them. The point of this slide is that sometimes it takes a second event to really get the person into this mindset that the world is horrible, it's dangerous, and I got to get away from it. Because some people are able to just say, well, it happened, and so on. But once you live in a world where it can happen anywhere, anytime, then the world becomes menacing. Then the future becomes threatening, and that's why people develop that particular problem. So how does a traumatic response become PTSD? As I mentioned to you earlier, anxiety makes us respond in order to lessen it. We run, we fight, we control, and when it can't be avoided, we fight our feelings. I don't want to feel like this. We have a memory, and instead of just living it, we tend to, I don't want to talk about it, we turn off the TV, this kind of stuff. The more we avoid our feelings, the stronger it gets. When we try to avoid reminders, we see them everywhere. And of course, avoidance could be physical or psychological. I mentioned to you before, if you're in a car accident and you say, okay, I had this accident at that intersection. So now you're driving near the intersection, you decide, you know what, I'm going to go this way instead. You feel better, which is fine, it's natural. But at some point you might say, oh, there's another intersection that looks just like that one. I think I'll turn this way now. And then next time you go, there's a lot of cars over there, so you go this way. At some point you start to avoid everything. And the more you avoid, but the same thing also happens psychologically. If I have a reminder and I turn off the TV or I try not to think about it, I distract myself, it gets worse. The way you deal with trauma is when you're hit with a wave of pain or horrible memory or anxiety, all you can do is let yourself feel it. It's going to hurt. Let it just be there. Let it pass. It's going to pass. And then you keep going. When you fight it, when you fight your feelings, they become threatening. I don't want to get it anymore. I don't want to feel that. I don't want to go back there. And again, that doesn't work. And that's why people get worse over time. The avoidance is what is the key. As I mentioned to you before, this tends to be a self-strengthening circle. So I'll leave you with this one last thought. Learning to walk alongside your trauma. I was talking to a family, a couple that lost their son, and they said that they went to this group, and one of the ladies in the group gave her this phrase, said, you don't get over your trauma, you learn to walk beside it. And I thought, wow, that's the most perfect description for dealing with trauma. You know, a person who loses their child is not going to not care anymore, not going to not feel. They learn to walk along beside it. So the pain is always there, you're always going to think about it, but you function regardless. And that's the goal. So people who fight their emotions too much, people who try to not think about it, people who don't want to remember, they end up becoming overwhelmed by these memories and so on. So the fact is that memories are never going to disappear. You have to learn to live with them. I don't like this. It's not as if I don't want to help someone forget, but they're not going to. So the goal is to try and live with it. Essentially, trauma, although painful, need not control the rest of your lives. And that's the goal of treatment, and it's the goal of anyone who wants to support them, be it family or friends and so on. Okay, that's it. There's our information on our website. You can read my blog anytime you'd like, and if you have any emails, you're more than welcome to send me an email. Thank you.